All right. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I'm Ed Musler with the Solid Waste section. Thank you all for coming to our North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality Environmental Justice Workshop. It's great to see everybody here. We have a full room if everybody makes it, and there are another 80 or 90 people online. So I see there's a lot of interest in the topic. A couple of things to remember. This is being recorded for posterity and also for other people to view in the future. There are lots of microphones around, so just be aware that they are very sensitive. They'll pick you up in the back of the room, so be aware. So we'll get started here. Do I just do, what do I do?
Arrow keys.
There we go. Okay, a couple of housekeeping things. You are in Green Square here in Raleigh. You've been signed in. Please, when you leave this afternoon, sign out. There'll be a way to do that. Obviously, everybody's here, so you parked either across the street in the parking deck. If you're on the street, please remember to keep your time up. They do check, particularly with the General Assembly in town. Restrooms in the back, straight out behind the elevators. Okay, there also is a break room back there. There's water, ice, and also snacks and drinks for sale. If we were to have an emergency, there's two things that we could have. If we have a tornado, and I don't think there's any in the offing, we will go back that way. Sherry will lead us out. I'll bring up the back. If there's a fire, we can go out the fire exit, and please go across the street into the courtyard over here, and we'll all gather together, make sure we count heads. Wi-Fi, there is Wi-Fi here. You can see the password there moving forward. So we'll get at all that. All right. But what'd I do?
Nothing, I think.
Okay. Again, just a couple of things for the benefit of everybody that's here. If you're online, please keep your microphones muted. We don't need the feedback, and your cameras off. If you do have questions and you're online, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. We are monitoring that, and we'll be able to answer those things. You all in here, obviously normal, silence your cell phones, please. We do have the sensitive mics, and if you need to take a call or make one, kindly step outside. So to get us going, though, we are very pleased to have our Secretary of the Department, Elizabeth Beiser, with us. And Governor Cooper named Secretary Beiser as Secretary this year, and she's the first female who's been approved in that position. And she oversees our agency, which, as you know, its mission is to provide science-based environmental stewardship for the health and prosperity of all North Carolinians. And we're all a part of that in the solid waste industry and a real integral part of that. Secretary Beiser, many of you, I know Dexter and some of the folks in the room might remember, is returning to us after 11 years in the private sector. She was our legislative liaison in 2007 and is kind of in on some of the beginning of all of this stuff. And so she comes to us and is going to say a couple of words. She's a graduate of UNC and has got her master's in public administration. So Secretary Beiser, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I'm always happy to talk solid waste, as Ed mentioned, and Dexter and I have the scars to prove. We're part of the 2007 solid waste rewrite. So solid waste always will hold a special place in my heart. So appreciate what all of you do. Environmental justice is a great topic for today. It's such an integral part of what we do here at the department. And it's an integral part of what you do every day too. The EPA's definition of environmental justice, and I won't read the whole thing, but it's fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people. At a very basic level, the way we talk about it at the department is it's about being a good neighbor. We all have the responsibility to be good neighbors, and at the end of the day, it's what communities are asking for. That you're a good neighbor in the places that you have an existing facility or are planning a new one, that you're out in the community talking with folks, and that you consider the people that are beyond your fence line. And that how your actions, oops, did I mess up something?
We'll get back.
Okay, how your actions will affect those that are around you. And I'll tell you that the public engagement and input that we get from community and stakeholders on environmental justice has really broadened our perspective and really helped inform the actions we take here at DEQ. It's helpful to hear from all communities. And it makes us a better agency. It makes us better able to respond more effectively to the people we serve. It's clear that more proactive community engagement on the front end leads to better outcomes and less issues down the road. We are taking a whole of government approach in the Cooper administration to address environmental justice concerns. Governor Cooper has made this a priority. We saw that in Executive Order 246 that he signed earlier this year. That in part focuses on equity and community engagement. And it requires all cabinet agencies to have an environmental justice lead, create a public participation plan, and to get training on environmental justice. But we can't do it alone as government. So we need to have our local government partners, we need to have our private sector partners working with us to really make equity a reality across the state. So I hope that through this workshop today, we can help you understand more about environmental justice, and share some tools that are available to help you engage with communities that have either an existing or proposed solid waste facility. And I know Renee will be a great person to provide some of those best practices, as she does that work here every day. So our goal is to promote respectful and meaningful dialogue with community members, organizations, the regulated industry, and the department. And I will often say that a healthy environment and a healthy economy go hand in hand. And engaging with communities where you do business is part of creating a North Carolina that has both a healthy environment and a healthy economy. So I appreciate all that you all do here and being here today. I appreciate your willingness to learn more about environmental justice. And I encourage you to utilize the resources that the department has. I know that Renee and Sherry will share some of those resources with you today. And please let us know if there's anything we can do in the future to help you as you are looking at EJ issues. So thank you so much to SWANA for organizing this event and getting the word out to your members. I'm excited to see how many people are participating, both in person and online. And I hope that you all have a very productive workshop today. Thank you.
All right, so a couple, I'll finish up here real quick. Here's the schedule for today. We'll go a couple hours this morning, take a break for an hour, and then an afternoon, and there'll be some breaks so that you can step out and use the restrooms. Lunch-wise, in an hour, right across the street's probably your best bet at the Daily Planet, but you are within walking distance of some other things if you want to grab and go. The Morgan Street Food Hall's down the street, and some of the places on South Raleigh are right over here. So what are we going to do? We're going to talk a lot today. We've got a lot of things going on. We're going to learn about the history of environmental justice, particularly in North Carolina and in DWM in particular, because we play a unique place in that. We're going to go through step-by-step instructions on using the tools that you'll need to make some evaluations. What your next steps may be. We're going to learn to determine how do you make that determination? Is there something I need to go forward? Do I need to ask more questions? And so we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we got you now.
Is that a yes? I can't see. Okay. Yes. Okay.
Okay.
We're back on. Okay. Thank you. I'm happy to be here today. We are going to start a little bit broad, and we're definitely going to dive into the weeds, deep into some of the tools today. So hopefully everyone will be excited to learn and see kind of what I do on a daily basis. And then I will pass it over to Sherry intermittently. We'll kind of be passing it off back and forth to talk about more department versus DWM specifics. I am the Title VI Environmental Justice Coordinator, and the Title VI and EJ program is located at the department level under the Division of Public Affairs. And so we work with all of the divisions across the department, but we'll be trying to focus today more on the waste management side. So, all right, so when we talk about environmental justice, we kind of need to level set with the definition. What are we even talking about? So I've seen distributional justice, I've seen justice or equity in the place of justice, but the concept's the same. So for distributional justice, this is what a lot of people think of when they think of environmental justice, and this is the equal distribution of environmental benefits and burdens. When we say frontline, fence line communities, this is what we're talking about, that community is feeling a burden And they may be seeing the environmental benefits of a facility if it's manufacturing something or a power facility. They're of course using the benefits of that facility, but they're feeling the burdens. So what is that geographical distribution? And that's a lot about what we're going to talk about today in these analyses. And then procedural justice or procedural equity is equal protection from rulemaking and enforcement. That's, if somebody calls you, if two people call you, reacting the same and taking it seriously, things like that. Also rulemaking, how are the rules even written? Process justice are equal opportunities for meaningful engagement. And this is a lot of the public participation and outreach that we're going to talk about today. So when you combine all three of those concepts together, you get the definition that DEQ uses, which is from the US EPA, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people regardless of race, color, national origin, or income with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So that's the definition we're working on today. We'll get into a little bit more about where are potentially underserved communities in North Carolina and what that specifically means later. But that is our overarching conceptual idea. So a little bit of history about how we got to where we are today. There was a practice commonly known as redlining that was very common practice from 1934 until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Three main things that you can take from this slide. One is the importance of mapping out locations for that distributional justice concept. Two, race was a central factor. And three, that industrial plants and transportation corridors were considered as detrimental influences, AKA nobody wanted to live there. So really important, this tool is a really great tool from Richmond University. Unfortunately, it is only for like metropolitan big city areas, but it is really interesting to kind of go back and see historical concepts of kind of how we ended up with the geographic distribution of certain things today. So fast forward to 1982, Sherry's going to talk a little bit more about the Pcb Landfill in Warren County, but for the environmental, it's fine. For the perspective, big picture environmental justice history, this was really the first time that civil rights protesting had been used in an environmental context. And so, of course, there was a community, did not want PCBs, this landfill to be put in their community and use things like laying down the roads, protesting, getting arrested, to really make that statement known. And so that was the birth of the environmental justice movement as we know it today. Of course, environmental injustices had been going on far before that, but that was really the landmark of the movement. So then we had Toxic Waste and Race, was a report that was published in 1987 by the United Church of Christ. And basically this report found that race and not income was the largest predictor of proximity to toxic waste in the United States. This report identified for the first time that communities with the greatest number of commercial hazardous waste facilities had the highest composition of racial and ethnic residents. In communities with 2 or more facilities, or one of the nation's 5 largest landfills, the average minority percentage of the population was more than 3 times that of communities without facilities, so 38% versus 12%. This was a very important scientific, academic addition to justify and solidify, I guess is a better word, the concerns of these frontline fence line communities. Then in 1991, there was the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, 4 years after the report I just mentioned. This was a 4-day summit in October of 1991. Whoops, sorry everybody. There were over 1,000 attendees from all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico, Chile, Mexico, and the Marshall Islands. And they went to redefine the meaning of environment. Environment was more of a remote wilderness and pristine natural landscapes rather than the environment of where one lived, worked, studied, played, and prayed. And so its discussion encompassed a range of issues from housing and transportation to worker safety and toxic pollution. So one of the main lasting testaments of the attendees' work can be found in the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice that lay out 17 main principles of environmental justice, using that definition of not just the wilderness as environment, but the environment where people spend their time, basically. So 2.5 years later, 1994, then President Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, titled Federal Actions to Address Environmental Justice in Minority Populations and Low-Income Populations. The purpose of the EO was to focus federal attention on the environmental and human health effects of federal actions on minority and low-income populations, with the goal of achieving environmental protection for all communities. The EO established a federal interagency working group on environmental justice, chaired by the EPA administrator and comprised of the heads of 11 departments or agencies and several White House offices. The EO directed federal agencies to identify and address disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of their actions on minority and low-income populations to the greatest extent practicable and permitted by law, to develop a strategy for implementing environmental justice, to promote non-discrimination in federal programs that affect human health and the environment, as well as provide minority and low-income communities access to public information and public participation. This last point conforms with the Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act, which provides that no person in the United States shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. President Clinton said, in part, that each federal agency shall ensure that all programs or activities receiving federal financial assistance do not directly or through contractual or other agreements use criteria, methods, or practices that discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Because the department receives federal assistance from several federal agencies, our agency is subjected to Title VI. Compliance with Title VI is not optional, and it is referenced throughout DEQ's authorizing statutes. All right, so that was a little bit of our history. So now we can talk about what we're doing today and tomorrow moving forward. So starting in 2018, the department created a full-time employee position for the Title VI Environmental Justice Coordinator. So that was a big step in the right direction. A lot's also happened since then, and Sherry's going to touch a little bit more on some of the milestones of the department in general. So I'm going to fast forward to January of 2022, when Governor Cooper signed Executive Order 246, titled North Carolina's Transformation to a Clean and Equitable Economy. And this directed a cross-agency approach, so all of the cabinet agencies, to designate EJ leads, which have been posted to our webpage, as well as public participation plans. And so DEQ already had a plan in existence, and so we have modified, made a few edits, and that those are all open for public comment until, I believe, the end of the day Thursday. So if anyone wants to go home and read some public participation plans, we would welcome your feedback. The next step for this, I believe, is the governor's office has actually secured philanthropic funds to bring on a consultant to provide training for the EJ leads that I mentioned before. This also is in line with Justice 40 from the federal government. There have also been several executive orders happening at the federal level to prioritize funding opportunities for underserved and marginalized communities. And so we've done that with several of our grant programs, including the 319 Impaired Waterways grants and the state revolving funds and other water infrastructure funding. So that's been a really exciting development for us. And then I mentioned trainings before, but we're also trying to do trainings for like you guys, for the general public, for our staff, for everybody. So everybody can get on the same page with those definitions and what the tools are to actually look at this. Because the first step is really to look at environmental justice data, and if you're doing a facility, citing a facility, looking around the facility, but also just connecting with people. So let's see. Oh, in the Justice 40 program, they did actually come out just the other day with the full list of the 72 programs on top of the pilot programs that they had previously announced. So if you've been following that, some exciting developments. They also have their mapping tool, the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, that is another way that they are identifying and prioritizing communities for that Justice 40 initiative. So at North Carolina DEQ, what do we mean when we say, can anyone actually read what those are? You don't know what you're saying. Hold on. Oh, can an announcement be made to those that have their cameras on? I don't know what the announcement was, but those of you that have your cameras on, please read the chat. Okay, so at North Carolina DEQ, we have identified what we title potentially underserved communities. And this is done at the block group level. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's about 25% of the state's block groups. It looks like they're all on the east side, but that is slightly misleading just given the scale of the map. There are a lot more in our urban areas than you can actually see at this map extent. So they are a little bit more evenly spread out than it looks. It's just based off of the population that determines the size of a block group. Again, I'll explain that later. Anyways, so the definition for a potentially underserved community is the following: racial and poverty rate. So we are comparing a block group area to a county as well as a state level to get a comparison going on to see if there is a disproportionate share of a specific type of criteria that we're looking at. But in this case, we're looking at race and poverty. So if the percent of non-white is over 50% or at least 10% higher than the county or state percent, as well as if the poverty rate is greater than 20% for that block group, and the percent of households in poverty is at least 5% higher than the county or the state percent. And so this is just an initial screening that we have been using. There is merit to identifying specific block groups and areas as potentially underserved, as long as we can all keep in mind the caveat that this is just the first screening. There are going to be communities that are not captured because of the granularity of data. We're only looking at 2 data sets. This is only one way to describe. We've compared what other states do. Every state has a slightly different definition. And there's going to be areas within these designated block groups that would probably not meet that definition of underserved. So it's important to do this exercise as a step, but also important to keep an open mind and not have it be like, yes, this is the end all, great, done. This is just the first step. So let's see. Oh, and I think we're working on adding the potential for limited English proficiency as well. This is our mapping system. I'll do a whole demo later, but the orange areas are also the state designated tribal statistical areas. So another thing to keep in mind when you're looking for potentially underserved communities. So in line with EO 246 and our priorities, as Secretary Visor opened up with, we have included environmental justice within our 2022 to 2024 strategic plan. So goal number 4 is to ensure the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Does that look familiar to anyone? Yes? Okay, good. We're paying attention. So that kind of is expanded to say that all North Carolinians should have access to clean air, land, and water, and should be able to live a healthy and abundant life no matter where they live, what they look like, or how much money is in their pockets. DEQ must be intentional in prioritizing and achieving environmental justice and equity throughout its programs and decision making. And so we have 4 main objectives. Ensuring the funding processes include equitable access for underserved communities, which I've already talked a little bit about how we're already starting to do that, and we're following Justice 40 very closely to make sure that any programs that DEQ administers funding through is also in alignment with Justice 40. Incorporate environmental justice and equity throughout departmental decision making. enhance transparency by informing stakeholders of DEQ regulatory programs and actions, providing access to community-level information, and increasing opportunities for public engagement, and then encourage stakeholder engagement on issues of concern to underserved and underrepresented communities. So it's a big priority for the entire department, and we're working every day, little by little, to advance just a little bit farther. One way that we are doing this is this new draft business toolkit. We just debuted this at our EJ and Equity Advisory Board meeting last month to receive comments back from the advisory board. We are looking to receive any comments and improvements on this draft business toolkit before it becomes not so much a draft. The purpose of the toolkit is to create a toolkit of resources and questions for businesses to encourage considering environmental justice early in the project process. So the earlier that you can consider environmental justice and connect with the community, the better. Just period, blanket statement. The sooner the better. The goals are to kind of get people thinking. A lot of them are like questions to start thinking through what might be of concern to the community for a specific project. So businesses can consider environmental and community impact during the site selection process. So businesses can meaningfully engage with neighbors early and often. And for businesses to incorporate enhanced environmental stewardship principles in long-term operations. And so that's a table of contents. I won't read all of that. But here are this is the first group of questions. And so really just starting to think through what are the potential impacts? What discharge charges or waste will the facility generate? Are there expected air emissions? Will any emerging compounds or PFAS be used in production? What kind of traffic will the facility generate? And will chemicals or waste be transported through the community? How much noise will come from the facility? Does this facility have to be in a specific location to operate, such as proximity to natural resources in the area? Will this project impact streams or wetlands? So this is kind of the environmental, think about what are some of the potential community concerns that we hear often from projects to try and give businesses that opportunity to think about right on that front end, and maybe how can I reduce this? Maybe a different site might be a better selection because it's farther away from people. We don't have the answers because every single case is going to be a case-by-case basis. That's one of the difficult things about environmental justice in general that people often have a hard time wrapping their heads around, but this is to really help businesses start asking those questions right from the beginning. So another set of questions are more population focused around proposed site. Will there be emissions or discharges that could impact nearby residents? Who will the neighbors be? Is the proposed site near a densely populated area, other commercial complexes, or several miles from the closest community? Are there sensitive receptors like schools, nursing homes, or hospitals near the proposed site? Is this site within a potentially underserved community, which is pretty easy to identify, which is in our mapping system I just showed? Will this project directly benefit that community? Are there any nearby American Indian tribes? And are you planning on engaging with that local tribal council as you would with a local city council or county commissioner? Does the surrounding community speak English and read English proficiently? And how will you engage with limited English speaking households to alert and inform them about that project? And what other facilities are located in the same area and what impact do they have on the community already? So just, again, some questions to get people thinking right off the bat. We are happy to provide this business toolkit to anyone who's interested in reviewing the whole thing. Again, we're trying to get feedback and have a helpful compilation of items. A lot of what we're talking about today is also going to be in that toolkit, all of the mapping tools and everything. And we'll complement another tool that we have that Sherry will talk about next. So I will pass it off to you, unless we're not doing questions. Yeah, great, okay. Executive decision.
Oh, good morning, everybody. Good to see you. I'm Sherry Stanley. I head up the permitting branch. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and background of environmental justice at waste management. So I'll start with the Warren County PCB landfill, and Renee mentioned this is kind of considered the birth of the EPA movement with the protest at the facility and the community engagement there. Anyway, I grew up in Vance County, which is a neighboring adjacent county to Warren, and what happened there was a Ward Transformer company had just tanker loads of used transformer fluids with PCBs in them. And they just rode down the side of the rural Vance County, Warren County, some Granville County roads, opened a valve and just sprayed the PCB laden fluids, you know, down miles and miles and hundreds of miles of road. So that happened, I guess, in the early 80s. It stayed there on the side of the road for a long time. I remember the signs there warning people that it was there and not to walk on it. I mean, this was in a rural area anyway, so most people wouldn't be walking out that way, but kids did ride their bikes. But anyway, finally it got cleaned up, and the decision was made to put it in Warren County. It was close to where the contamination was, and, you know, nice good clay soils, nice huge farms, huge tracts of land that they could put it on. But I think EPA promised that they would come back and get the waste as soon as they could treat it. They would come back, and they did make good on that promise. So that covers Warren County PCB landfill. In the 90s, that's when EPA finally promulgates the Subtitle D, Part 258, which require liners for the MSW landfills. So, of course, we promulgated rules as well to follow suit on that. And we transitioned from like 100 plus unlined landfills in 100 counties down to about 23, some counties, some regional landfills. So we always consider that a good thing, minimizing those landfills and putting the liners in. We really didn't have any rules or statutes in place in the solid waste statutes, but there were and still are statutes in the local government, the county government, and the municipality rules that require a socioeconomic study be conducted when you site a new landfill within a mile of an existing. And so that was really the only thing when those new landfills were coming out that required any kind of environmental justice review. In the 2000s is when we finally get regulatory authority to require the EJ evaluations, and that, of course, is in the solid waste statutes. I can read it for you. The department shall deny an application for a permit for a solid waste management facility if the department finds that the cumulative impact of the proposed facility, when considered in relation to other similar impacts of facilities located or proposed in the community, will have a disproportionate adverse impact on a minority or low-income community protected by Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1960. The subdivision shall apply only to the extent required by federal law. And then, another thing that happened in the 2000s, finally EPA comes back in and treats those soils at the PCB landfill through a thermal treatment process, and I guess Ed and Pat Backus helped get that closed.
That was actually $14 million of state money, and it was done because Governor Hunt in 82 said that the state would do it, and then he was governor again in 86 or 88, and the community came back and reminded him of that.
Okay, well, I will change the slide.
Yeah, and we spent $14 million detoxifying that landfill.
That is, well, I'm glad that we were able to do that. 2010s, okay, so I think the EJ process for waste management was really honed in this decade with the coal ash landfill permitting. So the reports that were developed at that time are very similar, and what we really based everything on for right now. for today's process in terms of report structure and data collection and tables. Also, in, I'd say 2018 or 19, maybe the EJ Advisory Board for DEQ. 2020, DEQ publishes their public participation plan, which kind of outlines the EJ program for the whole department. Many of the DEQ divisions get all their sites on the GIS layers, and that goes, public on our website. And that forms the basis of the community mapping system. But the community mapping system really adds a lot of other like health data and stuff like that. There's a lot more than just where the sites are. There's a lot of EJ data, health screening data that goes with that. Also, this is when waste management, solid waste section has transitioned from doing the EJ reports ourselves and pulling the data and writing the report. And we are transitioning then to having the applicant and their consultants prepare and submit the reports. To aid this transition, we published the site-specific guidance for the solid waste. And y'all probably seen this, and it's the link is on our website. We're committed to achieving the department's public participation in environmental justice goals. We released this guidance in June 2021, and it kind of goes into us, wanting to commit to the DEQ goals, but also it goes step by step into using the tools, the EJ screen tool, what census data you need to pull. It has templates for the tables that you can put in your report. It has a list of everything that needs to be in your report, how to use the community mapping system. Now, throughout this transition, it's been kind of touch and go at times, I think, but I think we've got that process honed, and as I find errors or people comment on problems with the document, we're making changes and hopefully, we want the guidance to be fluid anyway, and we want to be able to change as the program changes, as many states and the EPA are working on EJ right now. Things will be changing, and we'll be changing the guidance as that happens. Okay, looks like we hit break time, maybe a little bit early, not too much. Yeah. Any questions now?
Just a question. Is there any provision for DEQ to look at landfills that might be on the border of North Carolina, like South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee? Do you consider anything like that?
That we have.
Within North Carolina that is close to the, are we looking at the demographics of the other states? Is that the question? Or are we looking at things that are just outside North Carolina that could potentially impact
The latter, that one, yeah.
that one?
Like if you were in Mecklenburg County.
On the other side of Carolyn's, just.
You guys might have a specific answer. I don't even remember what I was at the other day, but somebody was saying that it's pretty common practice for states to try and communicate between if there's a facility right next to our state that might potentially impact our state, that there would be a courtesy, oh, heads up, this is happening. But as far as do we specifically look at that? Not unless we were to receive a complaint. That has not come up to date, or at least in my awareness.
Yeah, it hasn't come up. But yeah, that's definitely something to think about and try to policy around.
If I could comment, it is not always a polite heads up.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Heads up to us too.
No, and sometimes it does result in legal settlement. We happen to have one.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Well, I'm sorry.
All right. right, anybody else or anybody online? Do you see anything in the chat? Okay.
What time you want everybody back?
Okay, it looks like everybody's back from break. Let's see, now we're going to start our instruction part of the workshop. We're going to talk about the data gathering, the report prep, and outreach, and go through the applicability review process, all the different tools for the data gathering, report contents, and how to reach out to the community. So applicability. Because of the process, proposed emissions or discharge profiles, or particular operational characteristics, certain types of projects or actions authorized by the department will require additional review to evaluate whether enhanced engagement with the neighboring community is warranted. In the Division of Waste Management Solid Waste section, the following projects or facilities that seek authorization from DEQ will be evaluated. That's all sanitary landfills. That includes MSW, B&D, and industrials. All MSW transfer stations, incinerators, and other energy or compost facilities which have or are perceived to have air or odor concerns. That includes MSW, medical waste incinerators, a waste energy facility, and the large type 3 and 4 compost facilities. So that's all the facility types. So any new permits for these waste facility types or substantial amendments to these facility types will require the enhanced engagement. Also, the division director can have discretion if a particular project is to have the EJ evaluation. A little bit about the review process. It's a joint review between the department and the division. So both Renee and I take a look at the EJ reports. The interview process to permit application review, where the consultant facility submits the application. We give you review comments, and then there's a resubmittal. So we might go through a few times on that. What we primarily focus on in that first review is the description of the facility and what the proposed permitting request is. And then we review the data. We make sure that the local area has been properly defined. What we look at is a minimum 1 mile area surrounding property boundary to the facility. We make sure the proper census tables are used, and that any census tract that is in that area, even if it overlaps just a little bit, is evaluated. We look at the data tables to make sure that you've screened properly and highlighted properly to define the community. And then once we're satisfied with the data and tables, then there's more focus on the report text and what the community means, how you're going to engage the community, and some other topics, cumulative impacts and that sort of thing. So all this is outlined in the guidance document, and that's when we get into the step-by-step instructions for the tools, and I guess we'll transition over to Renee to get started.
Okay, so we are going to really go into depth right now. So when we are preparing EJ reports, so I do these for other divisions. So for example, if the Division of Air Quality has a permit application that comes in, I will conduct the first draft of the EJ report internally. So I do these frequently. Brenda Boykin here, just to put her on the spot, is our EJ program assistant, and she also assists with those. So we are here to help answer any questions, because we do these all the time if you guys are trying to do them and run into any questions. So we'll start with that. What we're looking at. So again, before we go into all of this detail, remember that we're looking at a smaller area compared to a larger area. Okay, that's our big picture thought process here. So The criteria we are looking at in our reports are race and ethnicity, age and sex, disability, poverty, household income, limited English proficiency, and educational attainment. So those last two, limited English proficiency and educational attainment, are really helpful when you're drafting like a postcard or a one-page flyer, because the general public is probably not going to read through a like 150-page permit application. I don't know how long actually Waste Management, is that how long? Yeah.
That's our review letters.
Okay, exactly. So, so your typical person is not going to, one, have time to do that, two, understand it, and three, that just sounds miserable. So anyways, it's good to write little like one-page flyers and postcards, something like that, to help communities understand what is actually going on. And if we need to translate those, that's really helpful to know into what language. A lot of people assume it is always Spanish. It is most often Spanish, but it is not always Spanish that you might run into. Again, we're working on adding this layer into the mapping system currently, and that will help. You can just go in, and if it's highlighted for the limited English proficiency, you can click on it and see what percentage, what language, and that will help you determine if you need to translate and into what language. That layer, since I'm on this, is if based off of Title VI requirements and an executive order that explained how to do this, I forget the number of, limited English proficient population groups which consist either of 5% or include 1,000 members, whichever is less of the population of persons eligible to be served or likely to be affected or encountered, would qualify for an additional review by the applicant or DEQ to consider providing translation services. And one thing I didn't go into today on a slide, I was telling Sherry as I was standing there, I thought of like 5 things I wanted to put on slides, but at that point it was too late. But I'm happy to talk about this more after, as we do have something called the 4-factor analysis that we conduct if it does reach that threshold, and that looks at things like the importance of the project to like immediate safety. So if there was like a spill or a release, like is it really pertinent to the safety of that community? What are the resources of the agency and the population to be affected? And those are only 3, and I can't remember the 4th factor, which is why I should put on a slide. But anyways, that's that idea. So the limited English proficiency and educational attainment are really good to help with those outreach, how to conduct the outreach, or how to construct the materials for the outreach. How do we find out what any of this data is? Those are the data sources over on the other side. So we pull from the U.S. Census Bureau. There are 2 types of census data that we use. One are American Community Survey estimates that are done in between the decennial, is that 10-year census that we just had done in 2020. And so the census data is that raw census data that is actually every 10 years. And in between that, they do something called the American Community Survey, which does have margin of errors associated with it because they only pull a small amount of people and then do fancy math equations and make it apply to the whole block group or census tract or whatever you're looking at. Then we also, that same data goes into all of the mapping tools are from the U.S. Census data. So biggest thing to understand. EJ Screen is the EPA's tool that they have for environmental justice screening, as the title would suggest. Our community mapping system as well pulls in census data, the same data that for the most part that EJ Screen has, as well as some additional DHHS health statistics are in our mapping system. We also have county health rankings that are really helpful to include sometimes to get a bigger picture of what a community is facing. But again, we can have some granularity of data. We get a lot of comments to have health data on a lower scale, but it's just not available and there's a lot of issues there, but we're still in those conversations. All right, so what are we doing? We're comparing local setting to regional settings. Our local settings are census tracts and a project radius. And so any census tract, as Sherry said, that overlaps with the radius that is determined for that project is going to be included. Some states don't, I guess what I'm thinking of is the EJ report for the Clean Power Plan that happened several years back, but they did not include census tracts that had just a little bit of it. And we will actually look, we have not included sometimes census tracts if they overlap and there is visibly, if you zoom in, it's like just a wetland and like nobody lives in that area. We will say something and say we will not be including that in this analysis. But for the most part, I'll show you a picture on the next slide. That is the local setting, is that the radius, and then any census tract that overlaps that. So it does kind of expand that out and we go a little bit further than just like a 1 mile cutoff. The comparison that we're doing, so this is different than our potentially underserved communities definition layer for several reasons. One, we're looking at all of the criteria that is listed here in these reports. Two, it's on a different census level, and that's on my next slide. And three, we are looking, we kind of based it off of it, but we are looking at 10% or more comparison to the county or state average, which is the same, or for race and ethnicity, 50% or more minority, which is the same, and 5% or more comparison to the county or state, not the county average. It's a typo for poverty. But it is different because we're only looking at race and ethnicity and poverty, and it is on the block group level. So the census data hierarchy. So we have our United States of America. Then you zoom into the state, and the state has the census data available. Then within each state, there are census tracts. I mean, counties. Whoa, jumped ahead there. Sorry. Within each state, there are counties. North Carolina has 100 counties. Within each county, we have census tracts, which is, can people see? No, people. There, can people see? Okay, here we go. So now these are our census tracts, which is what we use in the EJ reports. And then we have the block group, which is what's highlighted. Oh, sorry, this is not hard for me to see. But this is the block group. So within a census tract, you might have 2 to 4 block groups typically. And then within that block group, there is a block in the block group. But the data that we use doesn't really, that's like a really tiny amount, and the data that we use is not available at that scale, so we don't even worry about that. There are other data hierarchies. This is just one of them, and this is what we use. There are data sets at like the zip code area. There are metropolitan statistical areas. There's other ways to pull data, but this is what we are pulling for our data set. So again, to reiterate, states contain counties, counties contain tracts, tracts contain block groups, and block groups contain blocks. So as I said, the Census Bureau conducts a new census every 10 years, and there are estimated values for the intervening years. The census tracts are just the statistical subdivisions of a county that aim to have about 4,000 people. Tract boundaries are usually visible features such as roads, rivers, but they can also follow boundaries of national parks or military reservations. Tracts are designed to be fairly homogeneous with respect to demographic and economic conditions when they are first established, but that also obviously changes a lot. And when a census tract does experience growth that is beyond 8,000 people, the tract is split up. So let's see. For the block group, it is a subdivision of the census tracts and contains clusters of blocks, usually around 250 and 550 housing units. So anyways, that's kind of how it's set up of what we're pulling. You can see in the map here, this is an example I pulled from one of our EJ reports. There is the facility right there. There is our 1 mile buffer, and it overlaps with 1, 2, 3, and just a smidge of that other one, but it looks pretty densely populated, so we went ahead and included that one. Okay, now we're gonna go to EJ screen. This is where the fun is gonna happen, technologically speaking, because we're gonna see if it works. Can everybody on the team still see what we're doing? Also, this is, I can only see it over there, so. Okay, so this is how we get to EJ screen. So EPA is actually coming out, I can't remember if I said this already, with version 2.0 later this summer. Right now, their EJ index only includes 2 factors, only includes race and ethnicity and income, I believe. And they are going to be working on incorporating, I think they said up to 5 is what they're looking at. We don't really use their EJ index, but it's an option if you're interested. So that's what this is right here. It was really great when we did this and had the presenter view here, and now I'm seeing that the plan may have backfired, but that's fine. So this is EJ screen. You can go in and you can type an address if you're interested in an address. Let's type in where we are right now. You can also change the base layer. This is a pretty common feature, but then I should include. There we go. Okay. So let's see. Not yet. Okay. So we want to draw an area. As Sherry said, we're looking at the property boundary. So we'll look at, we go here, here. Really bad, but sorry, I can't see very well.
It is hard to do.
And then we'll add 1 mile. Add to map. You can even give it a little title if you want. And then these are the reports that we pull the 1 mile radius data from. So for race and ethnicity, we're going to pull from the 2010. For income levels and age and sex, I think we pull from, no, age and sex is also 2010. For income, we pull from the ACS estimate. So I've downloaded both of those. Also, EPA is very happy to do trainings as well on their mapping tools. So if you guys want something more in depth as well, I'm happy to connect you with the people who help you with that. I can't see what this says to save my life, but this is the population that within a 1 mile radius of where we are right now. Let's.
About 14,000.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. 44% people of color. There's 7,524 housing units. And then it breaks down, the race is this. This is the 2010, so they still haven't updated. That's probably why they're coming out with 2.0 also, is to update their census data. I didn't think that, but and it just breaks it down between each race and ethnicity here. And then you can see there is population by sex, there's the age brackets, and then I think household, whether it is rental or owner, which is kind of an indicator of wealth and I guess sustained, not sustained, historical wealth, built wealth. If it takes a lot to put a down payment on a house, and so if you can't afford to do that, you can only continue to rent. Anyway, so then we have American Community Survey estimates, and you'll see this number is slightly different with 18,000 people and 33% people of color. So we have changed slightly with the population trends since 2010. But again, has some of the same data in this report. And these are easy. These are super easy to do. It took me like 2 minutes to do this if you know how to do it, and just print it and just get like a really quick snapshot for any potential facility or any facility But then the ACS also has English proficiency, household income, other stuff that I can't read, more English proficiency. Yeah, so a little bit more data on the American Community Survey data, which is why we also pull that straight from the census, because not all the same data is available. Okay, so any questions on those just straight demographic reports?
That, when it does the gathers the statistics, it includes the whole census tract or whatever the block.
So it's doing a little algorithm in the background that is it's taking the data from those block groups is the level I believe that it does it on, and is estimating what that 1 mile radius is based off of those.
In the buffer act. Okay.
So it is an algorithm, it is an estimate,
Okay.
even for the US Census data, which is like the 2010, which is raw data, it's still an algorithm to pull some of that.
Do you think the 2020 stuff's coming out pretty soon?
Hopefully, it's posted on the census website.
Our demographics have changed significantly in the last 10 years, so.
Yeah, which is why it's really interesting to just see the difference even between the 2010 and the ACS. Okay, so you can do so many things here. You can select specific block groups. You can select a census tract. This can be an easy way to see what census tracts you are around your project. If you have someone who is GIS proficient, I prefer to do it in like ArcGIS Online, or I mean desktop, not online, because I just have an easier time using that and making the maps and doing the labels and everything. But this is another way that you can find out what census tract it is. You can see the boundary. You can so here they've had the different units I kind of described. You can do cities. You can select multiple things. You can just drop one little pin. I think the path is like a road kind of long thing. So then one of the other things that they've done is you can actually save a session, which they didn't used to have available. You can search to add, you can add your own data layers if you have specific data layers and you are somewhat GIS proficient. You can add it to the file. There's a lot, if you search geo platform, you can find lots of things on here. You just want to be careful, make sure you're adding a data source that you trust and it's not like just some random person put together this data set. And it does tell you, I believe, the last time it was updated, which is another thing that's important. Yes?
Would another geo platform possibly be a county GIS system of zoning or comprehensive land use plan?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. Yeah, let's see. And then, oh, you can even measure the distance from one thing to another. That sounds fun. And so then they also have some of their maps within here. So they've added some of these pollution sources. It seems too zoomed in to do all of this, but you kind of get the idea what these are. So it looks like, I think what they've done is they've ranked block groups or tracts based off of number of things, but I'd have to go back and look at their EJ screen, how they did it document. But then we have different indices. And so we have people of color, just raw percent. This is, I believe the demographic index is their EJ index. But you can kind of see, just get different, whatever you might be interested in. You'll notice that these are similar to the data sets that we include in our reports from the census as well. And then you can add some health disparity data, which we don't typically use. We've been in conversations with DHHS about the data sets that go behind the scenes into this. And we're in discussion with them is I guess what I'll say, but we still don't really use these because as I said before, it's hard to get the data at this level of granularity yeah. Anyways, then you can also add Yes, hold on, almost, I'm sorry. Am I on the X? Good, okay. Then you can also add some climate change data, which is also newer within EJ Screen. So wildfire has, I bet it's pretty low in Raleigh, but I could be wrong. Let's see. It doesn't look like it's loading or if it's any different. Anyways, so here we have all of that stuff, which is kind of extra and not necessarily needed for the reports, but fun to play around with. What we do like to use though are for the sensitive receptors. And so you can find EPA regulated facilities which are not sensitive receptors. That would be more in the potential for cumulative impact portion, but you can add schools, you can add places of worship, and then you can even click on them and find out what they're called. This is usually the first place I start is within EJ Screen. Hospitals, parks, you can even add other environmental data such as non-attainment areas and water features. Prisons and public housing are pretty interesting as well and good to know. Tribal lands and indigenous areas, I think the only one that pops up is our federally recognized tribe, which is the Eastern Band of Cherokee Nation. So I think that's the only one there. But anyways, as you can see, there's a lot of things that you can play around with and add within EJ Screen. Anybody have any other questions about EJ Screen? Yes.
So can you bring in, we get data for the state. Is there a way to select the state as a whole besides bringing in a shapefile for the boundary?
Great question. Let's see if I think we can if we do this. But it doesn't, I might have too many things open and I can't figure out how to close things that I've opened now because I can't really see anything. But I believe that you can select a state as a boundary. Any other questions? Okay. I'm going to exit all of these. And these demographic reports are also an easy thing to add as like an appendix or something, just so that we have the raw data as well. Okay, so that's EJ Screen. Did I? All right, so then we have our community mapping system, which is really fun to use also. So when you open the page, you can do a lot of things here. The glossary of terms tells you every single data layer that is within the mapping system. The how-to user guide kind of walks through some of the main things with screenshots and how to click on things, and is another great place to start. We also have a training video. It's my voice, so I don't like to watch it, but you guys are welcome to watch it. We have some frequently asked questions as well, and then just some background information. So a little bit of supporting material. We also have this survey that's always open. So if you guys have a data layer that you specifically would like to see in there, you can submit that, and it's always good for us to get feedback. And then haven't updated that yet, but here we have other state and national mapping tools, so you can kind of compare if you are interested and see how other states define underserved communities, how they do their mapping. It's all very different across states. I believe Michigan is the most similar, or maybe it's Minnesota. No, I can't remember. But anyways, you can play around with lots of stuff there. Our mapping tool we designed to be very dynamic and let the user define their own community, because All right, I'm gonna make everybody, raise your hand if you know what census tract you live in. There you go. So, I also don't know, and I've even looked it up and forgot, but it's not really the scale that we like operate on. That's just the scale that the data is available. And so that's part of why EJ Screen does some little algorithms. That's similar to what ours does. It pulls in the data from any census tract, or actually block group, excuse me, that is within the map extent on our mapping system, and averages them together, because we're letting the user define your own community, because my community is going to be different than Sherry's community, which is going to be different than Director Michael Scott's community. Welcome. And so that's really important to let someone say, this is where my child goes to school, and this is where I go to work, and then their neighbor can be like, this is where I live, and this is where my child goes to preschool, which could be different. Anyways, you guys get the point. So again, you can enter in an address, you can search, you can also zoom in. As you zoom in, it will start to auto-populate with all of the DEQ permitted facilities and incidents. And so this is very similar if you guys had used the waste management tracking system. Is that what it's called?
Site locator.
Site locator tool, my apologies. But it actually includes data from all of the department's divisions in here. So you'll see it starts to populate. You can also see the potentially underserved communities layer is there. And so if you click on this, it will give you just a brief overview of the block groups population, total population, and then a breakdown of minority and low income. Okay, and then if you want to go to the EJ tool, you can click there. But I'm actually not going to go there yet, so got ahead of myself. Okay, so you can take off any layers. Currently, I will just say disclaimer, the air quality layer is broken, so you can't use, you have to turn this layer off if you want to print a map. So we're working on it. Anyway, so you can turn on and off layers that way. You can add in environmental data. I don't really know why that's there as well. But we have conservation areas and flood zones, which can be really interesting to add on as well. Okay, and this is where we're trying to add the limited English proficiency. All right, so I said we wanted it to be dynamic, let the user define their own community. So this part is different than the report part, because this part is if you're just like, let me just kind of see for my own knowledge. If you zoom in, zoom out, pan across, this is going to automatically update how many of each type of permits or incidents are within the map extent that we're looking at. And you can even drop it down and click on one and pull it up. So really great way to dynamically, try not to use that word too much, look at what an area looks like. And then if you want to, you can click in specific permit information. I think waste management is probably doing the best job of connecting all of the Laserfish files so that if you want to find more information, you can see the documents link. Each division is in charge of their own data set, so it is very dependent upon what division it is as to how far along they are in updating their system to be online. But anyways, great way to get more information on specific facilities if that's what you're interested in. And then kind of mirroring EJ Screen that I just walked us through, we can do the same thing here, and we can draw our property boundary in this random triangle that I and we'll add 1 mile, and we will report. And remember, I've turned the air quality layer off because technical problems. And this has 0 facilities in this whole thing. So let me do a different place. That would have been good. Okay. So you can zoom out and you'll see the 1 mile buffer is around, and then it lists out the numbers of each type of permit. And then you can print this. Again, that print button will be grayed out if you have your air quality layer turned on for now because technical problems. But once it prints out, it will have a little map that shows what we just did. And then it also tells you information about every single type of permit or incident that is within that 1 mile. And so this is really good overlay with the EJ screen printout 1 mile. So these are 2 things that you can print out really quick, really easy, and get a good idea of an area pretty quickly. And this will eventually load. Just is trying really hard. Okay. So then you can see we have a map that points out what the area looks like. So that is the facility side of the community mapping system. I think that's pretty much what we want to talk about for facilities. So I'm going to go to the environmental justice tool that is within the mapping system, and this is more focused on the demographics and the health data. Again, very dynamic. I'm just gonna say it again. As you zoom in and out over here, you'll see that when I first did it, it flashed on the block group that I was clicking on originally. This data is pulling everything from the block groups within this extent. So again, as I zoom in, pan across, you'll see an update, which is also just really interesting if you're looking to just kind of play around. And then we have the statewide demographics and the state health dashboard comparisons, because again, we're really interested in comparisons of smaller areas versus larger areas. The health dashboard is on a county level. Again, we get a lot of comments that they would like it on a smaller level. We also would like it on a smaller level and working on it. But you can go through and see the different demographic indicators that we have. I don't know if anybody can read these, but I cannot from where I'm at. Here, I think this is renters versus owner. Again, this is age, limited English proficiency. So it is within there, but it does not specify what language at this point, which is not the most helpful. It's a good starting point to say, okay, I need to look into this more, but it would be more helpful if we had the language in there, which is what we're working on. And then percent with a college degree, and then back to race and ethnicity. And then same thing, you can flip through the different health data indicators as well. If you're interested in pulling in the facilities, you can click on the facility map as well to overlay that component as well with this part. And you can also, instead of the facilities, do sensitive receptors. And so this is another place to check. This has nursing homes as well, which I don't believe are one of the automatic ones in EJ screen. So this is another good place. And then the third best place to look for sensitive receptors is just Google Maps. I always go there as well and just see if any of the data sets miss them, because sometimes if they're really small, it's a really rural area, sometimes they're not included in data sets, sometimes things have closed, sometimes things have opened and the data sets just haven't been updated. So the most up-to-date thing is usually Google Maps. So I always like to double check that. And I think that's the community mapping system. Great, okay. Any questions on the mapping system or associated documentation or anything? Yes.
A couple questions. When you're on the mapping system, is there a way to download the data? To do that?
So not directly from the mapping system, but within the glossary of terms, there is a link to all of the data sets that DEQ hosts on our open data page. And so all of them are available for download, but the best way to get to them is not actually within the mapping system. It's actually through the glossary of terms.
And then, is there a way that the mapping system identifies variables that are from the census block versus or the census data versus EJ screen versus what you have that's different?
So our demographic data as well as EJ screen is the census data. We did not pull in the like EJ index values and scores that EJ screen has. We've talked about doing that, but again, we don't really use those because we have some concerns with the data and the manipulation of the data. But we could do that. It's something we've been discussing. We could keep discussing. And then our potentially underserved is just a selection of the census data. So all of it is actually the same like census data source. It's just, I guess, calculated or selected differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so, but there are variables that you all have, the EHS list already.
The EJ screen doesn't.
It doesn't have that, right? You've got additional variables that are not in those federal warehouses, I'm guessing.
Yes, we have a few different data sets, but for the most part, we had a lot more different ones. It was really good. And then they updated theirs and they added a bunch that we had added as well. So they're not quite as different as they were when we first created, which is great because now more states have access to that data, but it's not super different data. It's just overlaying. The biggest thing is really that we have overlaid all of our facilities that we permit and all of the incidents with that data. And you could do that in EJ screen, but you'd have to go through that geo platform search or download the shapefile. And so it would just take a long time.
On the mapping tool, I didn't notice, you have it where we could open up a layer and look at the attributes for a particular layer in an area? And
Yes.
you select them and then
What, I'm not sure if I'm following. What's,
like, all right, whatever the red squares are, yeah, those. Can you open the attribute table like in a regular? Like,
the attribute table. So
or you have to go to download the shapefile?
I believe we turned the attribute table off because there was confusion.
Okay.
When we had the beta version, we had it open, and I believe we closed that because people were like accidentally did things or something.
I can see that being confusing.
But if you would like it turned back on, you're welcome to make that comment, and I can bring that back to not many people. We're the team.
People in this room.
Any other questions?
When I'm back on the city payroll, I'll look harder at it.
Yes.
With respect to doing reporting analysis, you mentioned you use all the tools, but as a side check, you go look at Google Maps.
Mm-hmm.
How much detail and redundancy are we going to have to do when we put reports together? Are we going to have to go out to every available resource, or is it you're going to say these are the data sets we use?
I mean, these are the data sets we use. Do you want to add?
Well, I guess you will have to pull it up in EJ screen, check the community mapping system to see if there are additional ones. I think you have to go to Google Maps anyway to get addresses for some of these. I'm not sure the addresses.
They're in. They're in there.
EJ screen. Okay.
Sometimes they're not listed because they just weren't added by EJ screen and then you have to go look it up.
So
But
sometimes you have to get Google Maps out anyway to look up the address, so you
If,
can just check.
if you want to skip the steps of doing it in the mapping system, you can just go to Google Maps. If you want to try and cut out steps, I would say go to Google Maps, and then you probably want the map from EJ screen because that's a pretty good visual, even though it doesn't necessarily have all of them. But I mean, frankly, it doesn't take more than 20 minutes to pull them usually. So.
And then a lot of times people at the facility will know things that are in the area.
Mhm.
So they know the churches or the housing or person homes. The area, if it's an existing facility. that you're-
Any other questions? All right, so the last one that we are going to look through is the census itself. So there's a couple different ways that you can pull data from the advanced search. And I believe, Sherry, we're planning to share this slideshow, right?
Yes.
So all the links are provided. So the way that I like to do it, and I'm pretty sure the guidance document actually does lay out the two main ways, but I personally like to go to find a filter and start with the geographies. And so, hard to see, because let's say state. Yep. So then I will select our state. Thank you. Then you can go to the county that you're interested in within the state. And so the other thing is if you're pulling, so like I don't always have to pull the North Carolina data because I have it in the tables already. So you can kind of not have to do it every time if you're doing multiple of them. Are we in North Carolina? We're in North Carolina. Okay. Let's just do, which one is that? Let's do Martin, so I don't have to keep scrolling. Back, and then we can go to Tracts. Does that say Tracts?
Below that one, yeah.
Thanks, guys. Okay, and then we scroll down to North Carolina. And what county did I pick again? Martin. And then we'll pick like 2 census tracts, let's say. And then from there, you can enter in a specific table ID. The table IDs are all listed out in the guidance document that we use. So you don't have to be guessing. I think E2 is race and ethnicity. So we go down to search. And why did it do that? I don't either. It's never done that before. It's fine. I also can't even see what it says. But you can go back and we can go back to our filters. Let's just go back. And we can do, let's try a different one. Yeah, okay. So then you'll click view, and then you can hide this and you can see, and then based off of the data that we input, you can actually, I personally just discovered this. This was a very good day for me. You can select these like that, and you can just copy it and paste it right into the table. And that was a great day that I discovered that. So I'm happy to share that wisdom with you guys. You can also download the tables and like manipulate them that way. But this is also, you can kind of turn. So once you get used to looking at this, it gets a lot more comfy to do. So if you're interested in downloading it, now I made that thing go away. I think can I download it from here?
Yeah.
Yeah, over to the right.
Keep going. There.
There you go.
Oh, yeah, one of the X's.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So that's another way you can do it. Yeah. Any questions on the census data? So this is, as you can see, this one has a margin of error, and the raw census data won't have the margin of error. Scroll over. So, it's a comparison. Yes.
I have a question about the comparison. So if a census tract falls within a 1 mile radius, we're comparing to that census tract, but was there any consideration of weighting percentage of the census tract within the 1 mile radius?
That's a really good question. We have not done that, no. But you make some good points. But the more you like weight or manipulate or anything like that, the more you're kind of playing a guessing game versus the data. And especially the data that already is an estimate, it's better to do less with it, I think. Because we also, I mean, it also depends if it's like most of the census tract, but there's a big city or a town where half of the town is just without the outside of the radius, then you're weighting it, but they're not even actually in there. So it would have to be like household based, which would be kind of hard to tell, I think.
Could you do it by block group?
Yes, I think the reason we haven't done it by block group, I believe, is data availability of all of this data sets are not all evenly available on the block group level. But I can revisit that, but yeah.
Are you finding any significant issues with the 2020 census data just because of how much fun it was?
I think the raw data is pretty accurate. The American Community Survey data for 2020 has a lot of warnings around it of like experimental data sets, and I can't remember everything they've said, but basically they had really low response rates because of the pandemic, and so it was just so little data that extrapolating that up to those different levels was pretty tough, and so I think that it's not as reliable. So that's actually why we haven't updated our potentially underserved community layer. It's still the 2019 ACS, and we have not updated yet to the 2020. We probably will, but I'm not sure if we'll actually replace it with that because it's just questionable.
So I have updated the guidance document to pull the 2020, but I found out that when you look at that data, a lot of the census tract information is missing. So you end up having to go back to 2019 anyway. And I tried to put a note in there that would direct you to do that if it didn't have the census tract data. So
My thinking is the 19 stuff would be better.
yeah. So I may go back and change it to the 2019 ACS 5-year. So.
Any other questions? Okay, so that's all for our data sets, and it's about 8 minutes before 12, but go ahead and go for lunch.
So daily plan is just like across the street.
Some of the reports and the elements, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. One of the things I just wanted to take a little bit executive privilege on and say as we go through this, I know we had a couple of comments or questions like, how much are you going to make us do, or can we, average things? And I think it's important, most everybody that's in this room is a technical person. Okay, we're scientists and engineers and hydrogeologists, and we want AB, 2 + 2 = 4. Okay, and that's not what this is. Okay, that's not what this is. This is the other stuff. Okay, so what you have to do, you can do anything. You may not like this, but you have to explain it. There has to be a reason. And what we're telling you to do right now is based on our experience, and where that experience came from is we sat down and for instance, we got told, do an EJ on the coal ash. Okay, great. What do I do? Well, I don't know, So we used our best judgment, like you would do with an environmental impact statement, and said, well, what are people worried about? What impacts can they have? What's going to affect their health? What are they going to be concerned about? And then we said, well, where did a mile come from? Well, we looked at it and said, it's within our 2 mile radius that you have to look at anyway in a landfill, right? Okay. So we said, well, and so we did things, okay? And when nobody complained and nobody questioned what we did, we said, okay, that's a winner, we'll move to the next one. Okay, we had a case here, downtown Raleigh. Well, a mile makes no sense in downtown Raleigh because there's nothing but commercial buildings, right? Okay, so they were saying, we don't have to go look a mile because, we've got other things to do. So just keep that in mind. How you manipulate the data or use the data is totally up to you, and then we'll, census, but there has to be a reason. Okay, and just like if you're doing a site study or you're trying to evaluate the difference between sites or you're doing an EIS, this isn't a go, no-go document. It's a community engagement document. It's a reason to have a discussion because the people that don't want you there are never going to want you there. Okay, but you are going to capture some portion of people where you can make them feel better because you can get them the right information. Okay, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, but as Sherry goes through and says, put this in the report, that's because so far this has worked. Nobody's sued us over it. We haven't lost, and nobody's not gotten their permit. So we're starting from there. Now, someday somebody may come up and say, we don't like the way you did that, and then we'll all have to change. That's why you always have to look on the internet, make sure you got the most current version of the guidance, because it's going to change. But where we are today is based on solid waste experience, and so far, we haven't had major issues. All right, so who's up next? Sherry, is it you?
That's okay.
Renee, okay. I'll let you turn to your own thing.
Okay. Okay. And a disclaimer, we just discovered in a sidebar conversation, we will make sure that all of the data table numbers are up to date in the guidance document. We had a little confusion. We will double check that after this. Okay. Ooh, jumping right on in after lunch. That's a doozy. Okay. But at this point in the process, we've talked about all the places that we can pull the data from. This is an example of this is, I think, disability for the state and the county. So this is our regional level disability. And once we've pulled it, as we know, we can copy and paste into the table, which saves lots and lots of time. Then what we're going to do is we're going to compare the county to the state and just see how the county compares for the indicators. And so for disability, we have the total civilian non-institutionalized population. Then we have it broken down by race and ethnicity, and then we have it broken down by type of disability. Now, we only pull in the type of disability if the disability total civilian non-institutionalized population is greater than 10% different than the state. Okay, but this way we can see who we are more likely to encounter and who we are more likely to need to provide accommodations for. As you can see, this specific example is Lenore County compared to North Carolina, and every single one of the indicators with a percent with disability is flagged when compared to the state. What we have over on whatever side it is, the equation is on my right side, is the state percent with the disability times 1.1, and that is 14.74. So anything that is above 14.74 would get flagged. And then you do the same thing for the race and ethnicity. Each individual one, you're going to multiply that. Do this, yes. You're going to multiply this number by 1.1 for this. Now for poverty, it's 5%, and you're going to do 1.05 times that number. And if the number in the county box is higher than that number, it's going to get flagged. Does that make sense? Okay. So then we have the same thing for the census tract. And note that EJ screen data does not provide 1 mile radius data for disability. So Sherry and I discussed whether or not this was the best table, but it was there and it's fine. It's a good table. They're all good tables. They're all important tables. And so here again, we have the census tract percent with disability Total civilian non-institutionalized population is 18.8%. The state, again, was 13.4 with that 14.74 as the threshold, and the county was 24, so with 26.4% threshold. So the ones that are flagged here are only flagged compared to the state. The census tract actually has either a lower percentage for these indicators than the county, or if it's slightly higher or the same, it's not high enough to get flagged. So that's of note. Now, this is the American Community Survey data, so it all has that margin of error, and you'll notice that some of them, usually there are some that are a little bit higher, but some of them are like 9% for Black or African Americans with disabilities in the census tract. The estimate is 18.3%, and the margin of error is 9.3. So it could be either like 9.3 plus 8 plus 18.3. It could be 27.6, or it could be whatever 18.3 minus 9.3 is. Thanks, guys. And so you have to kind of keep that in mind. This is kind of what we were talking about with the 2020 American Community Survey being even having, I think the issue is that margin of error is really high for those. And sometimes you will encounter something that has a higher margin of error than the actual estimate. And so those are tough situations, but we're working with the best available data that we have. And so kind of keeping that in mind, always taking the estimates with a little grain of salt of, this is an estimate. And again, it's not even available for every single, the estimate is 0 for some of the race and ethnicities listed here. So there is no percent estimated, but that could also be incorrect. So just kind of keeping all of that in mind, this is how we flag. So we flag the county to the state. And then when we look at the census tracts or the radius, we flag those compared to the county and the state. We don't have to compare the radius to the census tract, or I think that's the only one actually that we've seen so far that we don't have to do. And then we don't have to compare limited English proficiency either. We only pull the limited English proficiency for the census tract because that is the population, or the census tracts. If there's multiple, that is like the immediate population. If you pull for the whole county, that might not really be necessary because the population might be in like the top right-hand corner of the county and we're down here. Does that make sense? Okay, any questions about the data table?
Yes, when you said we don't have to compare the 1 mile radius to the census tracts, is that specifically for disability or is that across the board?
So that's going to be across the board.
Is that a relatively recent change to the guidance? Because I was told to compare the 1 mile radius to the census tracts.
No, because what we're doing is we're comparing that local setting to the regional setting.
Oh, no, it makes sense. I just, that was feedback
Right.
I got. Some of my flags were kind of weird. I was told to fix them to make this comparison more clear, but you didn't say there was no mention that I didn't have to compare the 1 mile radius to the census tracts.
Okay.
I think in the past, we have compared it to census tract, county, and state. But you don't have to do the census tract.
I don't think that's in the guidance though, because.
It could have been, because I did a couple reports across several iterations of the guidance document. So
Yeah.
it could have been just a holdover that didn't get caught.
So the guidance document is an iterative document. Our EJ reports have been an iterative process. They haven't even stayed the same name. We've included less data at certain points. We've included more data at different points. We've changed the data tables at certain points. We had a lot more under the subject. We had like age and sex as well. But we did an overhaul 2-3 years ago on the department level and just were like, what data is actually going to be relevant to this decision? If there is a higher percent of females with disability in this area, is that going to change our outreach? Is that going to change the decision? And so we kind of did this big, how can we streamline this, make it more manageable, and cut down on some of the data that really isn't going to change our final outcome. So anyways, all of it's an iterative process. apologize if you were.
No, it's fine.
something. This is now what we're doing. If we did something different before, that's totally possible that you were told that. But at this point, you do not have to compare the 1 mile radius to the census tract because those are both considered the local setting, and the regional setting is going to be the county and the state. That. Cool. Okay. Also, not all of the data tables are available in EJ screen. So some of the like disability is not available. Yes.
Just one question. In making the comparison of the county and the state, is that also dependent upon the type of permit that you're dealing with? I mean, if it was for instance, if it was a county permit for a landfill, why would you really be looking at the state? So wouldn't it be dependent upon the type of permit that's being applied for?
You mean if the county is the applicant?
Yes.
I mean, unless the application, unless the thing was a county-wide decision, that would be the only time. Otherwise, what we're trying to do is look at the directly surrounding community. So regardless of whether the applicant is a local government or a private entity, you still are gonna have to look at the directly surrounding community.
You're saying if the service area was the state, then it would make sense to compare the state.
No, because it factors into your cumulative impact, and the people that are being impacted are, it's that, there's too many polluting things in my neighborhood.
Right.
And so, you have to look at the impact of whatever the operation or facility is on the neighbors that are closest, but then then you also have to look at it on a societal basis. So you would say, because you can have a community that feels like it's being put upon, but in relationship to everybody else, they're not. So you tend to get pretty much the same answer.
I think you're asking about service areas versus potential impact.
This may not even be the case anymore, but if a particular county was operating a landfill for the county for their own waste in the county, it seems to me you would be comparing the community that Ed is talking about to the rest of the county, if that was the service area. But I'm not sure I would follow why it would then be compared to the state.
Okay, I think I understand the question. Let me know if this is more what you're going in the direction. So New Jersey just went through this whole process and because they passed this first state legislative cumulative impact law. And they went through this whole thing about the geographic unit of comparison is what they're talking about. And so basically it's, if a county, let's say that county has high poverty rates and it has pretty high people of color, that census tract might not even get flagged as a potential environmental justice community if you only compare it to the county. But then if you pull in the state, all of a sudden you're like, well, in comparison to how we perform as a state, the poverty level is 20% higher in this census tract, and it's 15% higher for this county. So that's why it's important to look at the whole picture. We also include the county tiers in our EJ reports to kind of get an idea of some additional countywide information. But it really comes down to the geographic unit of comparison as New Jersey has deemed it. And they actually also compare to the state and the county for theirs. And they just went through a very robust process. Does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Okay. Any other question? Yes.
Alluded to earlier about COVID-19. How are you all thinking about the data now that's coming out? Is it going to be relevant? Is it
the census data?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the actual census data is relevant and is good and sound. I think it's the American Community Survey that we have heard is questionable from 2020. So I think we're mostly still using the 2019 data, and that is a question that we need to look a little bit deeper into to figure out exactly how we want to move forward with the data sets that we have. Because again, these are the best available data sets. So how do we move forward is a very good question that we're trying to figure out also. Anything else? Okay. So we have on our webpage, on the EJ page, a list of all of the EJ reports that we as a department have conducted. And as we've said, they are different. They have changed across time. I think the first one is dated from like 2016. And so a lot has changed and evolved. So some of them aren't even called the same thing, but ultimately for every intent and purpose, they are the same thing, except for the snapshots have less information than the full EJ reports. And so you can go look on our website and see an example of some. I'm happy to pull one up if we want to, but I feel like we should keep going and only do that if we have time. So, it's you.
Okay, so a little bit more about the content of the report. So when you get started, of course, give the facility name. If you can throw in the permit number and a street address, that's usually pretty good too if somebody wants to like look it up on a map. Of course, there's a lot of maps in the appendices, but anyway, talk about the type of facility, a little bit, about the construction of the lined landfill, leachate collection, that sort of thing, and a little bit about the permit application that you're submitting that is triggering. Let's see. Also get into a description of the potential impacts of the facility, like impacts to groundwater, surface water, air, and talk about the mitigation measures for these, and then the checks that you have on that, like the liner to protect the groundwater, and then the monitoring wells that monitor the performance of the liner, so that sort of thing we would talk about. So you might also talk about the fact that you have stormwater permits and that you perform, monitoring regularly, see if there's anything discharging to the surface water. Same with your air permit. If you have a Title V permit for your landfill flare or your energy system, generation system, then talk about that as well. So I'll go ahead and talk about this traffic route analysis a little bit. I think this is kind of a carryover from some of the coal ash permitting, but in our statute, there's a requirement to do a traffic study for any permit application for a landfill or a transfer station. So whatever you need to do for DOT, I would just include it. Sometimes they will require you to do a full study, and sometimes you'll have to, you can get a letter from the district engineer saying that you don't have to do a traffic study. I mean, they might know that there's one been done recently that would cover whatever your plans are. Let's see. Talk about your area demographics. You want to talk about this? Because that's just talking about it again.
So then we have all of the study, the area demographics. That is all of the data that we just talked through and how to pull all of that, the comparison of that data to the local to the county and statewide regional area. Then we also have the county distress rankings for the county tiers that I just mentioned. And then the presence or absence of state designated tribal statistical areas. So those are within the mapping system. I mentioned them on the screenshot. I forgot to point them out when I did the actual demo, but those are the orange shaded areas. The other really great resource is, and I believe this is linked in the guidance document, but we'll we'll be double checking the guidance document. Now we've talked about it so much, you have to make sure it's all up to date. But there's also a website, the Commission of Indian Affairs has mapped out, and they have a map that is, I think, titled Counties in Which Tribes Reside, something, I'm not positive what it's called. But that's another really great one because it also covers the whole county. And so if you're working on a project within that county, it's just best practice to reach out. I mean, we call it government to government connection, but I guess if you're not a government entity and you're a private entity, it wouldn't be that. But that's the idea, is, you know, consulting with them on any actions or decisions that are going. So I think the other thing,
Hey, weren't you the one that made the announcement?
Okay, so then we also have the limited English proficiency and the potential need for translation services, county health assessment from the county health rankings and roadmaps, identification and location of sensitive receptors. We also talked about the potential for cumulative impacts, identifying local surrounding permitted sites using the DEQ community mapping tool. That's a really great way to kind of get at that. Just a reminder that the statute does say that it says specifically cumulative impact of the proposed facility when considered in relation to other similar impacts of facilities located or proposed in the community. And so thinking about what Sherry was just talking about what potential impacts could be, and then looking at the types of facilities, and then maybe looking at EPA's ECHO, the enforcement and compliance is History online. There we go. Good. I just keep you guys on your toes. So those are the main ways we're getting at that at this point. And then description of community engagement measures that you're planning or have already done, and then summary of the potential impacts on the community, the mitigations, measures that can be or will be taken, and then the conclusions. And so starting out as a draft, and then at the end, I believe Sherry's going to talk about that part. Sorry.
So, in regards to outreach, for sanitary landfills, we've been trying to push the draft EJ report back to the point where the local government issues their local government approval or franchise. I mean, that would be the ideal situation, that you would have that report ready and that you're already engaging the community when those local government decisions get made. I guess we'll probably expect that in the future. And we're trying to also get the draft EJ report kind of included in the EA that's required in the site suitability. So anytime there's a new facility, that's probably going to get triggered earlier in the process. And then when you're doing the modifications, most of the time for those, you have to go back to the local government to get some of those
Sherry,
things updated. Yes.
just real quick, because you're talking about that, and I'm not technically, I don't have a technical background, but in regards to doing the EJ report, obviously for new facilities, but which modifications require an EJ report too? Just any expansion, vertical or horizontal, or just any
What
modifications?
is classified as a substantial amendment in the statute? So that's a 10% increase in your service area, your annual tonnage, your approved capacity, and all this information should be in the franchise or the local government approval. So if you go 10% over those numbers that are already approved by the local government, then you have to make a substantial amendment, and that triggers the EA, it triggers a traffic study, it triggers
So it'd be something where you have to go back to the local government.
anything.
Okay, not, hey, I'm doing my next phase or, any of the routine things. No, this is where This is where there's going to be something that changes the already approved facility plan based on triggering. It depends on the type of facility, but basically, for landfills anyway, what Sherry says, those things always, within the rule and the statute, trigger quote unquote new.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so if I'm reading that correctly, when the state is ready to hold their public comment period for the draft EJ, it's on the applicant to let everybody know. The state doesn't reach out to the community or.
Right, we've been trying to get that down to the applicant consultant level too, and to send those sensitive receptor letters out.
So then that would include what, immediate adjacent property owners and sensitive receptors? Who would be the distribution list?
The sensitive receptors definitely identified in EJ screen, or community mapping system, or the Google Maps. If you have some vocal neighbors or groups, go ahead and send the letters out to them. If maybe there's a vulnerable subdivision or mobile home park or something like that, that's pretty much immediately adjacent, I'd say send it to them as well, like an adjacent property.
So sensitive receptors that have been identified, plus anybody that we feel needs to be in the know. Right?
And we've done letters, sometimes we've done within 1 mile, and we've even gone out to 2 miles. When we've done outreach before, it never hurts to do more and make sure the community, like what Secretary Beiser said at the beginning, it's about being a good neighbor, ultimately is kind of what it comes down to in some instances. And so making sure that it's a transparent process as much as possible and getting everybody on the same page is never a bad idea.
I just want to clarify who was doing the outreach, if it was the state or if it was the applicant.
Right, so that's getting pushed to the applicant as well. So, okay, so I talked about early on in the process, and you just mentioned, okay, so we'll also have the draft EJ report available once we have the draft permit and we have a public comment period, and we typically have a public hearing. And so that's the time that you would send out those sensitive receptor letters, and in those, let people know that pertinent dates, have links to the documents, and we can get you those and the links to the hearing and that sort of thing. Okay, for other solid waste management facilities, so these don't really, transfer stations, compost facilities, incinerators, or they don't have the new permit designation really like the landfills do, but we're calling a similar substantial amendment would be a 10% increase, say, in the waste tonnage we're accepting, or if you're going outside a service area, bringing in a couple more counties or something like that. So a new or substantial amendment to a transfer station would also require the user report. And so for those facilities, we also don't have the draft permit like we do for the sanitary landfills. So we just go ahead and get the applicant to send the sensitive receptor letters out early in the process as they can, and just have be available for comments during the whole review period for the transfer station or other facility. And so in that case, they could comment anytime during the application review process. Today, we really haven't had that many comments from the sensitive receptor letters that have been sent out. So I guess I'm a little disappointed. I don't know. I don't know if we're reaching people.
Well, it's hard to track because we don't necessarily know how someone finds out about something.
Exactly. But you'd think if they got a mailing, and it's probably okay to put in there that if you don't want to contact the consultant, to contact the state, or maybe if you don't want to contact permitting, you can contact, Renee, or if there's an anonymous comment tool also. So maybe we ought to wrap that into the letter as well. But That's evolving. Okay. So really, it's our aim to solicit the comments from the community, and then effect changes in the permit for facility operations if necessary. And then let's see. Here's some examples of an outreach letter that we did for one of the coal ash landfills. And then there's a postcard that was developed for a transfer station.
Okay, well, before we go on to the next one, can I just say a few things about the outreach?
Okay.
Sorry, this was another place when I sat down this morning, I realized I wish I had put a few more slides in. But for the next training. So best practices for outreach is early and often. Okay, so as early as possible and multiple times if possible. Also multiple methods if possible. A postcard as well as working, trying to get creative here, working with the local government, or if you are the local government, their Facebook page, their Twitter, especially during the pandemic, we've really had to get creative with our outreach methods because we can't really go door to door, but like business, what we would do often before the pandemic, and we're starting to do again, is actually go to local businesses, specifically ones that we feel like a laundromat is more likely to cater to a lower income crowd, not necessarily, but more likely. And so going to those businesses or local businesses, like a local restaurant, and then through word of mouth through the community, then it can start also getting spread around. So it's not all just on the applicant or DEQ to do the outreach. It's once it starts, if it's done recently, hopefully then it starts kind of circulating in the community. So just want to say a little bit more about that aspect.
Well, yeah, and the other thing, just like anything you do when you're public process or whatever, is it's certainly documented. The last thing we want at the end is somebody coming in, well, I didn't know. And then you pull out a list of 27 ways that you reached out and everybody else in the community knew, why didn't you? So, there are a lot of things like that. And as Renee says, it's all about getting information. The more you reach out to people, if you don't hear crickets back, okay, great. You did your job. If you get certain, trends developing, then you know where your efforts need to be made. And so, if you look at all these things, like what Sherry said, each one is dependent on what's the type of facility. Why would we do this on a substantial change to a transfer station? Well, because when you think about it, if you're taking more waste, you have more truck traffic. People may be happy with 20 trucks a day coming down the road and not happy with 50. And that's the idea, to have that dialogue. And with a landfill permit that lasts 60 years, you don't get a pass once in 60 years. So, if you make it bigger, if you do something, then the community, gets an opportunity. Remember, this is engagement, okay? And it can get messy, but the idea is to educate and to engage and hopefully avoid all of that.
Okay, and then after you do the engagement, you'll circle back in the EJ report and talk about this, that you mailed the letters out. Who they belong to, a copy of the letter, or the final. Usually we have a draft in the draft report. Also, if you received or did not receive any comments, put that in the final report as well. And we haven't had to do this yet, but if there are any changes recommended for the permit or for facility operations or construction, then that should be in the final report as well. We finish up, T. Burton? We'll do
10
questions
minutes.
first?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let me get this straight in my little mind here. So we're submitting a draft report to you. You're going to review it, you're going to approve it and say, yeah, you guys knocked this out of the park, go ahead and do your outreach. So that point is when we actually send out the mailers to everybody, let them know what's going on. And then we got to come back around and then resubmit the EJ report back to you saying this is what we did and this is the outcome?
Yeah, you just update like the one section, like the conclusions, or there should be a section in there about engagement. Typically, and you can just say, okay, we sent the letters out on this date. Here's what we sent, who we sent it to, and we didn't receive any comments. And really, that's it. It's not like you have to go back and give any data. It's just updating the outcome of the letters. Okay. Wait, oh, she came. I'm sorry.
Here's somebody else.
It's kind of a-
I'm just wondering about the demographic information, particularly of language and education. How we're going to address community engagement if we have high population of groups that don't speak English well, or who have don't have high school education. There may be some issues with literacy. Do you have any methods to address that, or do we?
Or we gave it to you guys.
If you have a problem with people who don't speak English proficiently, then you will need to translate the letter or the postcard into whatever language that you need. We will also do that for the public notice for the draft permit if it's a landfill, and we'll place it maybe in a newspaper other than or that was specific to that language.
Yeah, a lot of these things, when you look at this information, it's like, it's not that now I got to do something. It's, I don't know what I have to do if I don't have that information. Okay, for instance, you were saying, well, maybe I don't have a highly educated population. Well, then that tells me what the state's going to do when we get involved and we go have our public hearing for instance, is, well, I'm going to make darn sure the people I take are not my nerds. Okay, they're going to be people who can communicate, who can translate complex things into something people can understand. As Sherry mentioned, you might have a language problem, so you do the local weekly that only hits that little neighborhood. That's where some of the sensitive receptors come in. It's, you know, they're sensitive because maybe something that's happened, like air pollution P2.5 from a diesel truck, is going to affect that daycare. So that's why we're notifying them and let them become engaged. So everybody doesn't always have to be notified because you may not be impacting them. Right. So you're getting information, and then the one thing that hasn't been said in all of this, that my experience from coal ash has shown, is once you've got your data, get in the car and go drive and ground truth it. Okay? Because just because you have a bunch of numbers doesn't mean that you know what you're dealing with. And I'll give you two examples. One, we were doing a coal ash landfill, right? Ding, 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 we've got a minority neighborhood. We went out and ground truthed it. You know what it was? It was the golf course in the gated community. Okay, so that census block triggered above the county average, but you know, they were $1 million homes. Okay, so, you know, we had another one where, you know, somebody was arguing, we didn't know, even though the local government, and they've done a lot of advertising on TV, radio, newspaper, you know, all of their public meetings. And they said, well, we didn't know. We went out and looked in their neighborhood and counted the number of people who had satellite dishes. Okay, that means they're all getting cable TV. It means they're not exactly super poor. Okay, and here's another one that we found was the people that had the newspaper box in front of their house. And it was almost every house in the neighborhood. Well, if you didn't read the newspaper and you're not picking up on the news, that's not my problem. I reached out to you and you had the tools to receive the message. So sometimes some of these things are to give you defensive postures, right? Well, you didn't let me know. Well, we can't physically talk to everybody, but as a block, we went out there and we know that cable's not available in that neighborhood, or it is, or whatever. And then the other piece that we did on the coal ash anyway, since the state did those, is we reached out and specifically talked to the local government officials. We had a meeting with like the chairman and the county commissioner and the mayor and whoever they wanted. Not a big thing, but we said, hey, we're doing this. Here's what it says. And then they gave us good feedback. They said, oh, well, you forgot this neighborhood, or don't worry about them, or hey, give it to us. We'll mail it out for you in our water bill. You know, there's all sorts of things that happen as you engage, and you get some of those engagement things by finding out what it is you have to engage about. So, just keep those things in mind. It's not, again, this isn't a checklist thing. It's like, which one of these things on the checklist do I need to do for my specific facility?
You have a question on the chat?
Right, so there was somebody in the chat that was interested in knowing if there were any, public meeting or door-to-door efforts being made. And so, Ed, I believe you clarified that, you have the public meetings, but are there any instances of like specific door-to-door efforts that were made for communication?
Yeah, sure. It depends on what the project is and who the community is, and oh, yeah.
But so I've had people be like, well, you didn't come knock on my door. And I'm like, well, personally, I'm one of the people doing the outreach and I am not going to be walking up to this rural house I'm not doing that, not only do we have the resources to do that, but I'm not doing that. So, but there are times that we've put like door hangers on people's doors, for that, but not every, we can't possibly do that for every single one.
So, the last bullet here, any recommended changes to permit or facility construction or operation as a response to the comments? Can you shed some light on what that might look like?
I can think back to some older landfills that made some concessions with neighbors. Maybe they bought some houses that were close. Maybe they put up some screening. They agreed to certain operational hours on Saturdays. They have we used to have a person from the community group that sat out the landfill at the landfill and observed operations. So, or they might have set meetings with the community group. Monthly meetings or something like that.
Set up a hotline or a mail address for people to ask questions and make complaints. Some of our larger facilities have agreed to try and restrict traffic to certain roads. Okay, the larger roads and not go through neighborhoods. We've had a couple of facilities that were lucky enough to be able to put an entrance on the back side instead of the front side. So remember, what you're looking at is you're doing all of this because somebody may be impacted and they may be disproportionately impacted. So it doesn't mean you can't do something, but it does mean, can I fix the impact or can I lessen the impact? Can I mitigate the impact? And so that's what we're talking about there. And we get that sometimes, in some of y'all's, when we're doing our normal process, oh, blah, blah, blah. I don't like that. And so we had a little conversation with the owner and we sampled groundwater 3 times a year instead of 2. So it's those kinds of things. Here's what we heard and here's why that's not, or here's what we did to make that better. Okay. You're always going to say, oh, my well's going to get impacted. Yeah, but we test the groundwater, we have a liner, we have a this, we have a that. And we move on.
Something like that. Line of C and D. Maybe it's close. I'm kidding. That's coming up.
Sherry, can this process be used to deny a permit?
What the statute says.
That's what the statute says.
What are the criteria?
Well, I'll tell you, we have not denied many permits, unless you look at the fact that every comment letter we send is kind of a denial, and we're telling you what you have to do to beef up your application, your facility, if you want to look at it like that. But, so I don't know. I think that's something we're going to have to look at some more, especially in light of the EPA and a lot of different states looking at cumulative impacts right now, because it's really tied to cumulative impact, that denial.
And the reason I bring it, we're getting ready to expand some of our drop centers,
Right.
which under the new change in rule will change our permitting criteria. And if we have an existing facility that's expanding, and some of these are in impacted areas, just by the nature of zoning and other items, how are we going to handle some of the challenges that come up with developing in an impacted area?
That's a local decision. That's why you all have to approve it. And so that's why this becomes a partnership. You need to know that before it gets to us. And, the one piece that, at least in solid waste, we have this in our statute where it says we have to, that we can deny it based on these factors. We also have in our statutes, if we deny it, we have to tell you what you have to do to fix it to get a permit. People don't understand that, permits are approval, permission to do something, not, but if it ever gets to that, Joe, it's going to be that it's such a magnitude, it's gone way beyond that. Whether it's political or just, it's got to be something really big. But I mean, if the neighbors come up and they scream at their commissioner and say, I don't want it there, then now it's the commissioner's job. He's the one is responsible to them.
And what kind of impacts are you going to have from that facility? Traffic mainly?
We will have less traffic than the shopping center across the street.
Right, exactly.
But that's the argument we have to make.
That's right.
And-
But what you have to say is the additional traffic based on what's there in the shopping center is not significantly impacting you on the basis of, and what's the impact? If it means I have to wait at the light for 5 minutes, that's not an impact. The impact is the idling cars, and that's not my fault. So you have to think, and as you do these things, who's my audience? What are they concerned about? And how do I address that? Okay. And everybody always comes up and says, well, you're impacting me. Well, great. What's the impact? Well, I just don't like it. Well, that's not an impact.
Well, another thing is, we didn't just pull all of this out of thin air. This was all based off of lots of research and guidance documents. So there's guidance documents from the EPA. They're continuing to update new documents. And so I would encourage you guys to do more, research and see what the EPA is saying, and I'm on that too. But don't just take our word for it. Do take our word for it, but don't just take our word for it.
And the other people that have had a very successful, much longer lived experience with this is DOT. If you've had a major road expansion or whatever, we'll see how they do it. You'd be surprised when they go in to have a community meeting, how they set up maps and stations and talk. And again, this is not the technical stuff anymore. This gets to be, soft. Okay. And, techniques. There's lots of classes you can take on techniques, but you don't want to sit in an auditorium, take questions because, there's power in numbers. So you want to conquer and divide, right? You have little tables and make them go talk in small groups. You get a chance to communicate with people. You get a chance to interact with them on a personal level, not the one guy that gets everybody all riled up and it turns into a shouting match. So again, that's what the basis of knowing your community, knowing your demographics, knowing what you're apt to run into. As one last story, we keep talking about the language and the people associating that with Spanish. It was very interesting. One of the original EJ things that happened in the department happened with our our dry cleaner program, right? They're reaching out, they're trying to put all this stuff out. Well, it turns out that the largest percentage of dry clean owners speak Korean. Okay. So they weren't getting the information because it wasn't in the right language and nobody, we discovered that. So now they have the ability to translate things into Korean because they have a significantly large customer base that speaks that language. So again, that's where some of these things come in, and some of them are easy. Okay, you've got this group. I'm gonna translate one piece. I've talked to them. They feel like they've been heard. They know. They don't have any questions. They go on.